Hey there, friends. It's the hat guy again. I think it looks a little bit rabbinical too. When I look at my hat, I think I might be Jewish sometimes, but actually I'm pushing it as a Quaker icon, and there's like the Quaker Oats guy on the box. Now that's a Pepsi property, nothing to do with Quakers in terms of finances. But cultural icons have their own dimension, right? And that's what I'm talking about here. The word dimension in English in general is a little bit slippery in that it has many different applications. When we're talking physics, it's often that we're wowing people with higher dimensions than they can visualize. And there's this tradition of you can visualize up to three, and then if you're more talented, maybe you can go to see the fourth dimension and so on. And the book Flatland by Edwin Abbott is very important here. Did I get his name right? Is it Edwin Abbott? Let me check that. In the meantime, I'm coming from a different namespace when I teach online here, which was put together by American futurist Buckminster Fuller, and he uses the word dimension in his own way. He has a deliberately remote vocabulary. He said so. Like in one of his early passages in Synergetics, he says, I'm going to use the dictionary and apply these words in ways that make sense to me. I may concede my usage in cases where, it's like he goes in these secret tug of wars as to who should use the word, but it's all private to him, right? He's talking about kind of his own private language and its evolution. And you could say that after Edwin Abbott, interesting. This very influential book in people's thinking. Even if you haven't read it, you find out when you study the humanities that people just copy each other, kind of like journalists. And certain boilerplate texts kind of creep into the lexicon. Like we used to memorize Latin and Greek passages. I did go to a British school where that was like a lingering tradition, but I came to it like in the 60s and that was kind of fading away. But to equate learning with memorization, to some extent that goes on, right? We do remember things. So dimension is one of those words that gets handed down to us through usage patterns and through like rituals and conventions, and we may not be prepared to think in terms of different namespaces. Like, could we go into a different way of thinking where we just don't use the word dimension in quite the same way, but sort of? Like, it's close enough to merit the word dimension. Remember how inches are a dimension and kilograms and stuff? And dimension analysis, like when we talk about dimension analysis in science, it's often to prove that the units are working out, like the units of action, velocity, acceleration. Those are dimensions, right? And then in machine learning and linear algebra more generally, it's anything that you can vary, keeping everything else the same. If like there's a necessary correlation where if you increase A, you also increase B, or other way around, if there's a causational relationship, then you can express one more or less as a function of the other and you say it's not independent. Whereas if I can vary my height but not at all change my weight or vary other things about me, then these start to become independent variables and we graph them at 90 degrees to each other, but then we run out of 90-degree angles. And yet we still have a distance formula that's workable in as many dimensions as we like. And so we have n-dimensional extended Euclidean geometry. And then we have the space-time geometry of Einstein used in the relativity and that idea of dimension. And they're not 100% the same, right? Non-Euclidean geometry, you could say, is geometry that takes the concept of dimension in a somewhat different direction. by adding time and so on. So there's 4D in the sense of adding time, and there's 4D in the sense of all these dimensions are more or less the same, and we can have as many as we want, and that's extended Euclideanism. And one of the great fathers of extended Euclideanism was Coxeter, HSM. I have a book about him here somewhere stacked up. Show and Tell, book by Siobhan Roberts, very well written, good book. And it's got some of the information about how Bucky and Coxeter related to each other. Initially with some suspicion. Then they got along better, and towards the end it was okay with Coxeter to have synergetics dedicated to him. That was with permission. That was not just out of the blue. But I wanted to find this paragraph here by Coxeter saying there's little to be gained by sort of confusing the tesseract with the time machine. The tesseract is like 4 dimensions, all physical, spatial dimensions, you could say. And then there's the 4th dimension is time. They don't mathematically get the same treatment. And Fuller's 4D is even different still. He's focused very much on the tetrahedron for its topological primitiveness, and he's kind of in a Kantian meditation or even a Cartesian one, where you're closing your eyes but thinking, what is res extensa at all? What is it to be in space, to be a self in a universe, to be a point in a tank, just to be in space? What is that? And can we really imagine what it's like to live in like one dimension? Can you think about compressing yourself so you live on a line? I mean, it's different from degrees of freedom. You only have one dimension to think in. And usually we show these from the outside, like we'll show a line and we'll put a little dot on there, and there's a creature on that line that thinks it lives in one dimension, whatever. But can you subjectively force yourself to think that you're a flat being, you yourself? Can you close your eyes and meditate on that? And at some point you might do a Kantian thing and say, no, actually, I'm always going to think in terms of in space, what we would call 3-dimensional space, but let's just call it space. Let's forget about dimensions. It's just space. So I'm in a container is what it feels like. And so then you think of a box. And where we get the 3 dimensions is a regular box has opposite pairs of parallel faces. So there's 6 faces, but we say 3 of them cover it in terms of dimensions. So it's 3-dimensional space. But if you actually want to have a closed box and you're in it, you want to have a lid everywhere you look, 4 is the minimum. That's like, you could say a sphere is even fewer faces, but you could also see a sphere as lots and lots of little micro faces, which is what Fuller does. He gets into the tetrahedron as his minimum. And this is a very interesting move. And it's what's even more interesting is how, even if we make it a work in the humanities, this synergetics, we don't get any attention to it. And yet there were practical outcomes. In other words, if you decide to compute the volume of a tetrahedron of edges 1 as having volume 1, you get this interesting and very accessible table. Now, this is Wikipedia here. Wikipedia has some problems with the tone and the content. But there are very few people working in this area that have any confidence that they can say anything about it. And I'm one of those people. So, in a way, I'm not touching this because it's not worth it if there's not going to be ongoing interest in Fuller's namespace, which I think I should admit is not that popular, but I do admit that in almost every video. I talk about windmills and stuff. There's no chance of Fuller's way of thinking sort of replacing these other uses of 4D, for example. They're not going to budge. Einstein, Coxeter, they're set. They're establishment. but can we sneak in a third meaning of 4D and get some value out of it? And that's the question. Here I've got like a circuit design. You could think of kind of a curriculum design where I have American literature, which is polyglot. In other words, I'm saying the inputs are from every language. And I kind of arbitrarily design an American literature bubble inside of which we have this sort of breakdown. And I put what sound like very technical subjects in here. But that's kind of an interface between literature and the kind of writing that we find in Fuller and design science or just design. We have these interfacing disciplines, architecture, planning. I put film under planning, which is kind of interesting because, but when you think about it, to plan ahead, to plan is to do storyboarding. And when you execute a plan, you're basically making a film. I mean, the film refers to the recording thereof. And nevertheless, you have scripted a piece of theater. When you build a building or a community, you are executing a plan. And you can think of that as a film. Same with the war. We call it theater, but a war plan executed is we're making films on this planet, is what we're doing, which is another way of saying we're leaving records of our decisions in our script writing. You can see what we planned based on these films that we're leaving behind. And by films, I mean records of any kind, right? So path plus stem, this is common talk these days that I keep jumping in and out. I know that's probably distracting. Path for me stands for philosophy, anthropology, theater, and history, plus STEAM, science, technology, engineering, AM, mathematics. Now, a lot of people want that A to stand for art, but I put in anthropology, thinking that art is also part of anthropology, even if it can transcend in some way. Or can it? Is man the measure of all things? These kind of questions. Anyway, I would encourage you to study the slides. I have a whole nother presentation. If you go back, I'll put a link in the comments where I go through all of these slides at a slower pace. And I do that more than once, actually. And my idea there is I want people to copy and imitate. Because I think if you're interested in Bucky Fuller's thinking, which was positive futurism, being more influential going forward, I think there's no way around actually tackling the content of synergetic geometry. I think we've exhausted all other routes and done a good job, but without tackling synergetics head on, I don't think there's much more we can do. That's, I guess you could say, bad news, but the good news is I think in this slideshow and in some other resources that are out there, Amy's book and other things, we do have the basis for going forward on that. In fact, there's been some new discoveries and things that I've shared in other videos that are quite interesting. In other words, there is a tiny subculture here, but it takes cultivation, right? And I think it's very, very rare what we have going. And I encourage you to think about investing, all right? Joining, investing, becoming part of this school of thought, you could call it. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now and pick this up on the next video.